Alrighty. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Opus Studios. My name is Sarah Delgado. I am the product marketing manager here at Opus. If it's your first time attending an Opus webinar, welcome to the Riverside Studio. As a reminder, you're an audience member, so you can see us, but we can't see you. But don't let that stop you from joining the conversation at any point. Please feel free to pop into the chat at any time. And then also, if you'd like to join and ask a question live, all you have to do is hit the request live call-in button, and we'll add you to the conversation. Without further ado, welcome to our session, KPIs to track and trigger successful training programs. Today, I'm joined by Bridget Siegel, the Chief Operating Officer at Hart House, and Darien Bates, the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Fourtop Solutions. Yes, you can go to the next slide.
I'm driving here.
Yes, so questions and comments in the chat are welcome. We are recording the session, so we'll send it in a recap in case you can't watch the full session or want to rewatch certain parts. Make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter to get that. And then we can go to the next slide. All right, a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to do a rundown of essential training KPIs and why they matter, how to tie those training KPIs back to your operations, guest feedback, and sales data. So thinking of the full data ecosystem within a restaurant. And then also how to take that data and prioritize your training initiatives around it. So a little bit of data storytelling. We have Darien Bates here as a huge expert to kind of knit that together, and Bridget Siegel, who will bring a ton of expertise from the operator side.
This is us.
All right, I'll pass it off to y'all to do quick introductions.
Great. Bridget, you want to kick us off? You want to do the honors of introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Bridget Siegel. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Hart House, like Sarah mentioned. I have been at about 4 startups now. I'm working primarily in culinary, supply chain, operations, strategy, kind of all the hats, as everybody who works at startups know and appreciate. Hart House, for those of you who are less familiar with the brand, is a quick service concept that is entirely plant-based and based here in Los Angeles. We have 4 restaurants now, and we'll be hopefully expanding to soon. Darien?
Yes, and I'm the CEO of Fourtop, which is a data infrastructure company that brings all of our restaurants' data into one place and makes it accessible and activatable for everything from, on the one side, BI, all the way up into automation and, while sometimes I cringe using this word, yes, AI on occasion for specific strategic use cases. But here, really excited. Actually, I have a lot of heart for this one, if you will, Bridget. Talking about data and training. And really, when we talk about data and training, let's talk about data and people. Training is a key piece of it. And I think before going into the data side, would just love to kick it over to you, Bridget, and talk about training. And Bridget and I have worked together for many years in various capacities. And if there's anybody who I would trust in the world of both operations, training, and activation of people, it would be Bridget. So talking a little bit about kind of why training and kind of its essential nature in restaurant operations.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Darien. Yeah, I think when we generally talk about people who are working in our restaurant, in the industry in general, there's kind of always this line of, is it altruistic? Is it because we're doing the right thing and you should do the right thing and take care of your people? But also, it's also an equally a business need. If you want to grow your business and grow your brand, the best way to do that at the end of the day is to take care of your people. And so it's good for you, it's good for them, it's good for the business, and kind of showing that using these tools, leveraging your data is, the most effective way to bridge those two concepts into just what you should be doing day in and day out to build your brand and your business. To that extent, we always look at it as, people are the bedrock of your business. And at the end of the day, I think of training as the bedrock of your people, and understanding that, most of the data and feedback you're getting back from your training program is more about you and what you need to do, because we operate at Hart House very much in a culture that operators are the client. Every decision we make should be through the lens of, how do we make Brett, our GM at Hollywood, how do we make his day easier? How do we make the guy who's closing at Monrovia on a Sunday night, how do we make his job simpler, easier, better? And so much of how we solution that is through our training program. And again, it's how you show up. And with a platform like Opus, what we love is how frictionless it is. I think that's a critical part of really any piece of technology that you're putting into the restaurant. If it is frictionless, you're going to get better adoption and you're going to get better results from anyone using it. And Opus is great in that fashion. It's an easy to use tool. It's easy for us to kind of upload and change and add things. And it's easy for the employees to use. They can whip out their phone, see an entire module, take the quiz, that data comes back to us. And then working with Opus and some of our other partners, including Fourtop, really making the content within it easy to digest, easy to deploy. It creates that environment where learning and continued learning is just part of daily routine. And again, just kind of bridging that training and data. The data we're getting back from that tells us what we need to do better to show up for our clients. So if we see that a module, isn't effective, or that, people keep missing questions 4 and 5, it's not a silver bullet. It's not telling us what's wrong, but it's giving us a clue on where to look and what we can do to improve our part of the business and the way that we're showing up for our employees.
Yeah, and I think that's a key thing. I think the journey in training and the journey in data feel actually more interrelated than maybe like I think is maybe initially considered. I think the idea of and again, Bridget and I have worked together for a while on this. The idea of data and training as being iterative, meaning that like you can put together training programs, but I think we talk about this as being a little bit of a journey. So we talk about, I'm going to jump over to a different deck here to share this, but we talk about this phased idea of data and training as being its own kind of progress. And so when we talk about these different phases, the first phase, as Bridget was talking about, is just like, is your training working? Like when you put together a training program, the reality is that until you have something out there, it's hard to tell. It's hard to kind of make a guess in the abstract what kind of training will work. And not to make this a big promotion of Opus, but one of the things, to a point that Bridget was talking about earlier, is the idea of like iterating quickly and deploying something and testing something is really important. And sometimes you can kind of operate in an environment where perfect is the enemy of the good, and you can't move fast enough to even get something out to test to see whether it's having an impact. And so being able to get something out is kind of phase one. Like, it's better, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, better to get something out there. But then that question of, you get something out there, and this is where data starts becoming the first part of the process. Does it have an impact? How is it having an impact? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And the second phase is the idea of like, okay, well, you now have a digital program, a training program that is quick to deploy. When do you deploy it? And it's phase two, the idea of like, how do you know when's the right time to start a training program, to send training materials, all of that. I think it's really easy to be in the space of, well, in the absence of knowing who needs to know what, just send people everything. And you can kind of get overwhelmed by the amount of information, and getting the right information to the right people at the right time. It's kind of phase two. And then phase three, we'll talk a bit about more. It's a bit more of a nuanced conversation about, once you have this kind of interrelationship between data and training and your employee, the kind of your overall employee profile and your employee relationship, how does that become more part of your culture, such that you can act on insights in ways that are accretive in a number of different ways, both from the brand experience, but also even from a profitability standpoint, from an overall kind of business operation standpoint. So want to kind of think about that as being a cycle, and maybe kick off kind of a first phase one and talk about that. So the first piece is just compare your participation to your performance. The great thing about any kind of digital learning management system training is that actually you can tell who's participating. Like you can actually see who's doing it and who isn't, and think about it in kind of two ways. Think about it in terms of aggregate impact. Is it having an effect on the overall team, location, things like that? And then actually, are you seeing that impacting individual, actual individual level kind of trackability on certain kinds of tasks that are directly related to the training? Love your perspective on that, Bridget, in terms of what you see kind of working with kind of like managers in particular as you start seeing training deployed, and how they've, kind of throughout your career, how you've seen impact in that way and tracking that kind of impact.
Absolutely. I think there are different types of training out there, and we're talking a lot of the time here about learning, and I would be remiss not to make sure we include development as well in equal measure. In any training platform, you need both. But I think when you look at how people learn, everybody learns differently. Everybody digests information in different ways, different speeds. Some people need to visualize, some people need to read it, whatever it is. So really making sure that your training program shows up in as many ways as possible to capture meeting everybody where they need you to show up is really critical. And using kind of this performance data tells you how well you're doing that. And so if you're seeing kind of data from your training platform where you're consistently missing this, or in corollary, you're seeing it in your guest feedback that you're either missing something on sanitation or a food item, whatever kind of sector of the business the feedback shows up, you can directly compare that to the participation and how your data is showing up on the performance, whether it's by person, by location. Again, it shows you where to look and what you need to do to cure it.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing. So I'm gonna show a couple examples here. So I want to talk about three kind of just measuring impact examples. And these are three kinds of programs. I want to be clear, I'm going to be showing some sample data here. We're not showing Hart House's internal proprietary data, but we are talking about things that we are working on with Hart House around this. But so
really
the
good
idea of what's that?
All the really good data probably is Hart House.
Yeah, exactly. If it looks really flattering, it's probably Hart House. So I want to talk about three things. These are some standard programs you see. These are some programs that Hart House is working on. So onboarding, front of house services and brand training for, and then actually device specific training. So when we talk about each of these things, we actually have training that is oriented around expecting to see or drive a specific result. And you want to actually see that training show up in the results. So the idea of onboarding, does your onboarding lead to better employee retention? Does your front of house training lead to better guest experience? Does your device specific training lead to better device competency, right? Those are very linear in terms of how we're thinking about it, but it's an important step to kind of assessing your training program. So just looking at something like this, again, this is more of sample data, but it's speaking to something that should be fully trackable within your system. So you say, you have your onboarding training, you can see it coming from a system like Opus, you can see who's actually completed your onboarding training. You should then be able to see, and we talk about this in terms of kind of binning or cohorting, people who've stayed for 2 weeks, people who stayed for 6 months, people who stayed for 12 months, people who stayed for 24 months. And it's a simple correlation. And You're not trying to do anything advanced statistical or anything. Just from the, of the people who've completed, how many of them are kind of the percentage of people completed, how many of them are in each of these bins. And so you can just see over time, like, does it have an impact on retention? So generally speaking, this is correlative, not causal necessarily, but it's all just about like saying, all right, am I seeing something indicating that there's a relationship? Again, you can't always say that this is directly causal. There can be reasons why people took the training. I mean, people who are not taking the training might already be on their way out in a variety of ways, but you should be able to start seeing at least the beginning point of some relationship between the two. So I just would start that as a way to think about this. Then thinking about something like impact of front of house training on guest experience. So just the idea of you take your 5-star kind of guest experience rating. You can get that from a lot of different tools. And you look at that relative to, relative to kind of the percentage of the hours that are staffed by people who are certified in that program. So think about that in terms of at any point you have say 5 hours, over the course of 1 hour, you have 5 hours of people who are working during that 1 hour. So you have 5 people on the clock, 5 hours, so 5 hours accrued. What percentage of those hours are staffed by people who are front of house certified? And again, you can break this down. If you only want to run this against people who are in front of house roles, you can do that. But the goal being over the course of a week, 2 weeks, a month, a period, whatever you're looking at, what percentage of my hours were staffed by people with front of house staffing? And then during those hours, what was the average GX score during that? What was the average guest experience score? And you should start seeing this positive correlation. If you're not seeing this positive correlation, that becomes a question of like, is it showing an impact or not? So again, looking for this kinds of clustering, and these are just different locations. Again, this is more locations than Hart House is working off of, but the same thing holds true. And the final thing is going to the device level. So the great thing about device level, especially imagine people who are clocking into a POS, what they're doing is they are actually identifying themselves on a device. So you can do the same sort of thing on like throughput on a POS or throughput on a KDS screen if you have people clocking into specific KDS screens, but it's where somebody identifies. And so when we talked about aggregate versus the individual, this right here is more of an aggregate score, right? You know people who are clocked in, but you're looking at the aggregate performance across. In this case, you're saying, I want to know people who are specifically that person clocked into that location. How are they doing using an indicator like void rate? So void rate in and of itself, voids don't necessarily mean a bad thing or a good thing. But what they mean is that if you look at that rate of voiding, there's an indicator that there's something about capability of using that system effectively. And especially if you run it as a relative metric, meaning that I look overall in the void rate relative to how accurately they're able to kind of complete their POS training in this case. In those cases, you should start seeing people who have high degrees of accuracy on their training accuracy should be actually seeing a decrease in their void rate. Obviously, you're never going to get down to zero. There's reasons why voids happen kind of naturally as a matter of course when taking an order, but just recognizing that you should see a decline in that. That's more of a bellwether on whether they're competent in general. It's less about like, does that a specific business outcome? But obviously there's correlative indicators there. So I'm going to pause there for a second on, I would call this like phase one. Just when you send out training, when you have people complete training, does it show up in your data? Anything you want to add to that, Bridget, before, and I see that there's some chats coming in, so I don't know, Sarah, if you're monitoring whether there's any questions that we should be responding to in real time here.
Yeah, I wanted to pause just a minute, and can we like zoom out? How many different technologies are you pulling, or how many different platforms are you pulling data from to build out like the first phase?
So in this case, we're really looking, we're actually pulling 3 from this one. So like if like looking something like this, you're pulling for your POS, you're pulling from your clock in tool in this case, just to get the employee information. I'll happy to kind of share what those systems are if Bridget's okay with it. But we're pulling from that tool and then ultimately pulling from an LMS. And in this case, like Opus, in terms of like where you're getting the actual completion on the certification side.
Got it. Michael had a question in the chat on, as it's okay, I'm going to read his question out. As it sits today, LMS and security fraud prevention tech are separate. Feels like there are synergies with those two in terms of training and tracking performance through video security. Thought.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think actually security data. So you have to be careful with it because I mean I think we're seeing in different places where there's some feelings of I think anytime you're tracking at the employee level, there's anxiety around big brothery type things. But I do think there's some systems out there that do a really good job combining I think especially some security type data, particularly like camera data, connecting it back to kind of POS use data, connecting that back to performance data, and you can also connect that back again to the learning management system itself. I don't know if that's helping, but I think the idea of finding those juxtapositions where you start seeing those indicators in the data and those opportunities on whether it is in the case of, I mean, security can run the gamut in terms of what we're referring to, but it's the case of anything from training to increase compliance, whether it's in kind of card handling, things like that, or whether it's ultimately in the case of something a little bit more specific around sort of how employees themselves are operating. Does does that make sense? And again, maybe I'm speaking more broadly, and if Mike wants to add some context to that, can kind of try to speak to it more specifically.
I think just to tack onto that, I think the question kind of below the question here is, what are other sources of validation of what's really going on in the restaurant?
Right.
And we know that there are a host of other opportunities and ways to do that. And there are some programs and tools we use. Secret Shopper is an easy one to get. Guest experience. We get guest experience feedback from feedback platforms, and then what I honestly think there is nothing more important than you go to the restaurant yourself. Like you have to be in your restaurant, seeing what's happening, talking to your employees. There's no better feedback loop than you showing up and talking to them and observing what's going on.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's the thing about data in general. Like, I love data in the abstract, but if you're not connecting it back to qualitative experience as well, like I think that's really the why is often hard to identify. Like the what is happening, even like what it looks like, and we can talk a little bit about kind of the next stage here. Was there any other questions, Sarah, that felt like it would be worth talking to now, or should we go to like this kind of phase 2 of kind of adoption here?
No, I think we can move on to phase 2.
Okay. So the first side, if you think about impact, the second thing is the idea of like targeting delivery. So one of the things I love about like a digital LMS tool, learning management system, is that you can actually get very one-to-one in how you deliver your training and trigger your deployment of your training. So I think about this in 2 buckets, similar to the impact side, is sometimes you want to deliver your training to a location, and that should be triggered based upon an overall trend or an identified opportunity across a location's performance. And sometimes you want to go directly to an employee, whether there are indicators that identify performance gaps and opportunities for specific employees. And I think this is one of those places where having that human view is really important alongside the data view. So you can set up triggers in your data to see something, and when you see it, say, okay, I want this thing to go out based upon this. So I can use a couple examples here. But I think one of the key things is that you ultimately want that human back in the loop to be seeing like, well, what is some of these data triggers actually end up looking like when I'm in that restaurant? So use 2 examples here. So GX data was actually some of my favorite data. I love a good like guest experience data readout. I think one of the things that, though, I think it often happens with guest experience data is that we try to get too nuanced in when we're soliciting it. You want as much volume as possible rather than more nuance. So I think when you're saying how do we get the maximum amount of kind of input back, the amount of color you get on that, I think when I think about, this is not a restaurant survey system, but like Uber. If you take an Uber ride, you get to the end of it, you say, this was a good ride, and it gives you like, well, select one of these things that contributed to your experience at Uber. You select one of those things. It just turns into things that are surfacing. It's not asking. It's asking like a 5 stars plus a single point of inquiry. That creates a lot of volume, but it also gives you like little highlights in what area could you be focusing on. So that's triggering from GX data. The other side is actually looking at system performance data. So similar to what we talked about in terms of tracking impact, you can look at system performance data and look at like, oh, there's employees when they identify themselves in doing certain tasks. When we see certain triggers being hit, let's trigger something from there. So I can show some examples here, but anything else you want to add to that, Bridget, before I just jump into some of the sample data here?
Let's go to the data.
Great, let's go to the data. So using this as the example, so this can look a little messy here in terms of the chart, but when I think about this kind of data, really when I think about this is going through essentially a triggering environment. So there's actually two different things happening in this data at the same time. So if I'm looking first for my indicator that there is a problem. I think one of the problems with GX data is that it often gets read back. I've been in a lot of conversations where people just on a weekly basis go through and read back results and find like, well, this is the biggest issue for each location. Say, go work on that issue. But it's like if you tell a restaurant to just go work on their biggest issue every week, week in, week out, you're often hitting that hammer too hard, and when maybe it's not that important. So when you relatively speaking to their overall performance. So the first thing I like to do is to look at whether there is a GX issue in general. So if you say, before I start looking at the issue specifically, I just want to look at whether I'm seeing a spike in issues overall. So here, as long as I'm seeing my under 3 stars stay under 10%, so my any responses back under 3 stars, anything under 10%, I'm not even going to trigger anything on. I want to hold back my triggering of training in this capacity at least, to only do it when I see something spiking. And so really it's just this period of time when I start seeing the training click over 10% of not being in top box. And that's when I want to start triggering something. So this is my trigger point, is saying, all right, I've eclipsed, over 10% of my reviews or my responses back are coming in under 3 stars. So then the question is, okay, well, what do I do about that? So then actually, once I get into under 3 stars, I start saying like, well, this location, what are its biggest issues relative to that? And I can see that like as a percentage of the sub 3 star issues, the issues that I do see actually spiking is actually this. What I see a spike as a percentage of this, the highest issue is actually food quality. Now I might see that there's a regular issues of lates and things like that, but those lates are while they may kind of comprise a fairly high percentage of things over time, they're not a part of this overall spike. So I think about this as a 2-phase trigger. A, am I having a spike in issues in general? And then if I am, what are the issues that seem to be increasing as a percentage of my total issues that are causing that spike? And in this case, I see my percent quality. I see a food quality issue that I want to go out. And if I have a food quality training program, I'm going to send that back and say like, looks like we all need a refresh. Maybe there's been a bunch of turnover recently. Something is meaning that our food now is going out in low quality. I'm going to trigger that to the people who are at that location and just kind of refresh them on some food quality training. And then do I see, when I go back to looking at the overall impact, do I see a recovery in my overall as well as a recovery in my food quality tracking? So thinking about that as being how do I both not oversend training just every time somebody has like their biggest issue was food quality? It's like, right, but they only had like 3% of their reviews were 3 stars or under. There's not really an issue. It just happens to be the thing that they got the signal and the noise is hard to separate. So once you have that trigger set, and whether it's 10%, whether it's 8%, whether it's 15, you can kind of look at what your benchmark is and how sensitive you want it to be. Once you identify that moment of there's enough guest experience issues happening right now, let's go find the highest priority issue on a per location basis. And that's when you can kind of trigger out. So that would be example one. A little bit of a complex thing, but if you run it back through a model in this case, and even automation tool, it actually can turn into a pretty elegant, low lift, kind of like only when you start, automating, only when you start having issues arise, to be pretty targeted about those issues. And again, what that quality or food quality training thing is, that's really where you need to be on the ground and looking at kind of that phase one of saying what does make a difference. I'm looking at like, how do I build my food quality training program so that they're impactful? So that'd be example one. A second example, this is going to look, again, kind of complex, but it's a pretty simple thing underneath the hood, is there are certain things that you can start tracking. And I chose 5 here. That's all trackable data down to the employee level, and saying, these are things that we believe are very important and that would indicate that there's intervention that would be useful. And we do this on an index so that it's all equal next to each other. Obviously, void rate is going to be, higher than attachment. I mean, there's going to be a different number than attachment rate. We normalize this on an index just to kind of give ourselves apples to apples. But when I look across an employee, I can say that employee A, for example, like they're actually very good at they're good at upselling attachment rate. Their absentee, these are all higher, the more positive. So they have a low absentee rate because it's a higher number. They have an excellent attachment rate, but actually they have a late clock in rate. And say like they tend to just show up late regularly. That's what we see in the data. There may be an opportunity, again, if you're going to trigger kind of employee-specific training, employee-specific intervention, saying like a reminder on terms of like, this is why it's important for people to come in early. This is, there are tasks that have to be done at certain times, and kind of intervene with specific types of training. On the other hand, people who have maybe like loyalty participation, people who, when they're working at point of sale, nobody seems to be participating in the loyalty program. They're not intervening to encourage loyalty participation. So what I'm looking for here is who actually has the lowest loyalty participation. Employee D, we're looking at that and we're like, right, their loyalty participation is low. If I'm going to trigger training to them, rather than sending them all the training about front of house or anything, it's like, let's just like send them a intervention training that's specifically about just like how are they encouraging people to participate in loyalty. And that keeps you from sort of being in that space of just hitting everybody on the head about like, come on guys, encouraging people to put in their phone number, encouraging people to sign up for loyalty. Like that can be lost if you just like send it to everybody. But the people who are showing kind of a lack of participation in that area, that helps you prioritize. So and reduces the overall kind of training burden on the employee while intervening where there seems to be opportunity. I'll stop there. Anything you want to add to that, Bridget?
I think you covered it beautifully. But we
Great.
can stop and see if there are any other questions.
Yes.
It looks like the chat might be stale, but I don't know if
I have I think, okay, so Natalie asked if the triggering, I think from example 1, is something that can be automated. Darien, you kind of hinted at this, like you could set up like alerts. Is that something that would be proprietary to like the work that Fourtop does, or is that something that you can facilitate with an actual platform?
Yeah, so that is something that we focus on. Again, we're an automation platform, so we take different kind of data inputs and we actually we trigger automations out through that. So we often work through APIs to say like, once data hits a certain point, hit this API and trigger out this event, right? In the event that it can also be done more manually, to say like upload a file of like everybody on a weekly basis. We're going to send out like our weekly training like tips to people. Upload a file here on the trigger and say like, this should all personalize by person. They should receive this versus they should receive this. So we do the automation and the data triggers inside Fourtop. But it's also something that I think there's, not to let technology be the blocker, not to let kind of system configuration being the blocker to the methodology. It's like, it's also something that you can do manually through some systems. So recommend kind of crawl, walk, run on that. Start with the idea of doing just kind of thinking about like uploading lists and sending to like, these people should be receiving these triggers just based upon the data that you produce. And then again, like it's possible to set up a full kind of workflows and automations on our side that in something like a Fourtop and something like a data workflow tool that can automate that.
Totally. On that note, Michael just asked, is there a way, and maybe Bridget, you can offer some insight here, in terms of what kind of visibility would you give an employee to see this kind of data aggregated? So let employee D know that this is where they're currently, where their standings are in terms of attachment rate, void rate, or is this something that you would probably just keep privy to management?
No, I mean, at the end of the day, the more information everyone in the restaurant has, the more successful the restaurant will be. I think how it's shared and where it's shared is critical to the success, because you don't just want to, say, here's a login to the Fourtop dashboard, have at it, because that's not going to do anyone much good. But being able to put this data in really digestible, whether it's graphs or, presentations, or however you want to share that information with your employees, like, absolutely, it should definitely be shared. And again, going back to, meeting people where they are, maybe it is that we're sharing it with the GM and the GM has full access, and then they're having one-on-one meetings with everybody, because again, just showing employee D here these metrics, I think you need that human touch of, this is how that's showing up, and here's how we can change that. Here are the new goals, because we have KPIs as a business. Every single person in the restaurant should have KPIs for themselves, for, doing their job great, for their development program, and using this data to supplement those conversations is really critical.
Yeah, and I
Michael,
think that's yeah.
I mean, we laugh, but I mean, we call it a scorecard. And so it's sort of, if these are the 6 critical parts of the business, and that may change over time, but if these are the 6 things and you're getting a score of 1 out of 5 and your aggregate's a 4.7, like that, to me, like, keeping things simple and digestible like that tends to be very effective. And then, depending on everyone's level of interest, double clicking through the data and getting really deep in the information, only leads to better conversations and fostering greater development and improvement against those KPIs.
Completely.
That's
And yeah, and in fact, that's a good segue, I think, to the next point here. And I want to call something out a little bit. I want to be careful about sort of credit score idea, because we're about to go into another, even a more complex version of this, where we start talking about like kind of full view of employee. We often talk about like view of customer and the idea of, like, again, CRMs around customers and how do you engage customers with rich data. There's also a question of how do you engage employees with rich data. And so I want to talk about this next phase, because I think there's, they talk about, like, you should never make your KPIs or your tracking metrics necessarily like your incentivization metrics. Because often you often end up impacting your KPIs negatively because people obscure them and things like that. It's why I like something like void rate. Void rate isn't necessarily something to incentivize people on, because it's like, what does it really mean? But it indicates that there's an issue in using something. So it's like, it's more of a bellwether than it is like a specific thing like that's costing the business. But it's a useful thing to note when somebody is performing at a high level or seems to be struggling with something. I think when we start talking about this next phase, and I will jump back to here for a second. So this next phase is this idea, and I'll let Bridget talk about this a bit, from like taking an employee first approach and starting to think about like how all this data from the training systems and beyond, how all this data starts becoming part of actually a relationship that you're building with your employees, to kind of move them from, I think, what is we tend to do in restaurants a little bit, which is to see employee as a cost. I mean, we literally, it is called a prime cost. And instead to think of your employees as assets. Like, what are you doing to support them to improve performance and help them then improve the overall performance? So we'd love, Bridget, if you want to take a minute and talk about kind of really where Hart House is on this, which I think is a primary driver for the brand. And then I can talk a little bit about what this means from a data perspective and also activations on that.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, this is almost kind of step 1, and then the training is step 2, the data is step 3, and then, step 4 is bringing all of that together, which Darien referenced, we'll get into after this. But kind of mentioned it at the beginning, beyond being the right thing to do, and it is the right thing to do to really invest in your people, it's also effective for your brand, and that's ultimately what we're going to show here. But taking a step back, we really believe that we're going to get the best business results if we're ultimately taking care of our employees in the right way. And so if you take a step back and you say, I want every single employee at Hart House to, be excited when they show up to work. I want to get the very best version of everyone showing up. And it's like, what does it take to get that? And, I think a lot of businesses will just sort of point to, oh, well, we give them a good wage rate. And yes, paying people the right amount is good, but we take a slightly more holistic approach to taking care of our team. And so, beyond a wage, you're thinking, if I'm showing up to work, I'm not worrying about, what's going on at home. If I get sick, what happens? I want to have a full life that has plenty of self-care for myself. And so we've created this suite of benefits at Hart House that aims at that holistic approach of taking care of the employees. So whether it's making sure everybody has access to insurance, to savings opportunities, to student loan reimbursement, to using programs like Honor Roll, where we can give points which translate into dollars, and everybody can just go, whether if going to the gym is your thing, if Netflix is your thing, we're going to augment your ability to do that, to take care of yourself when you're not at the restaurant. And so all of these things sort of add up into the employee package that we're really investing in you as a person. You're part of the family. We say that a lot. And we mean it. We want everybody to feel like they're part of the family. They're part of making this brand what it is. There's that ownership piece to it and that camaraderie to it. And so employee as an asset, yes, but employee as a partner too is an equal measure. And so having that investment in them means, we're going to get really high quality employees and really high performance out of those employees. And it costs more upfront in sort of supplementing all of these programs. But as Darien's going to walk through in the data, we're getting our bang for our buck if you're doing this the right way, and you're taking sort of this idea of, we're taking care of our employees. We have the best version of our employees showing up every day in the restaurants. We're going to train them. We're going to give them all the tools to be super successful in doing that job that day. We're going to read the data and see, is that tracking? Is that performing? Where are we? Kind of a SWOT analysis, if you will, by employee, by restaurant, by brand. And then sort of take the action that Darien's going to walk us through now to make sure we're optimizing business performance.
Yeah, and I think this is a key thing, because I think it's very easy to say we want to take care of our employees. I think it gets harder in the face of kind of hard numbers and that tendency to say don't love how my SPLH is looking right now, and to try to react immediately back to that and to cut costs quickly. And so one of the things, I talk about data as being a time machine sometimes. And by that, I mean, you can see the future with it. You can predict where things are going. And if you're like, if this keeps going in this direction, I'm likely to see this outcome. So you can pull that outcome forward and say, that decision you're making right now is going to have this outcome. So what I think about in terms of, and what we're working on with Hart House is this idea, and sorry for the eye chart here, but I wanted to kind of really go through and think about an employee as actually, yes, a human and someone we care for, but also as a set of, as you can see them, much like you would with with customer behavior, you can see them in all these different areas. And so we broke down this idea, we're breaking down this idea of an employee with all this data coming from different places, all this information you have about them. And what does that mean when it comes to that employee's capacity to deliver the ideal brand experience, and that employee's capacity to handle the workload? And so we take things from like, just their tenure and attendance. Tenure and attendance is data that people have on everybody, but frequently ends up just getting, put into one place in kind of an HR side. It's used for payroll, things like that. But it can also be a strong indicator of employee engagement, employee interest, and some of those tenure and attendance pieces is actually like benefits participation. Like benefits participation is a huge deal. Like again, like as Bridget brought up, you can often think of benefits participation as been like, well, what are we doing for them? But actually, it's also an indicator of the value that they're getting from you and their commitment to the brand. Are you providing them benefits? Are they making use of benefits? Is there a stickiness to their engagement with you, right? And one of the major things we look at is retention is a huge driver of capacity, meaning the longer that they're there, the more they can do, right? The more they can do, the more you can lean on them, and the less you need other people there to do it. So we talk about this. We talk about tenure and attendance, big deal. How long have they been around? And also, what are they showing by? Are they showing up on time? Do they change their shifts a lot? Do they show up? Do they clock in too early sometimes? So clock in precision. So the number of minutes difference. And this over here, people can use different models. I like a good Cosmo quiz style where you can just kind of like add up these metrics based upon where they sit on thresholds. And again, the model can be a little arbitrary. I mean, I like to use different types of models. You ultimately want to create a model and then test it over time to see whether you can tweak it and test and see if you're getting the results you're expecting. But this is a notional model. Again, tenure and attendance, a big deal. Training and certification, huge deal. Are they getting certified? What is the accuracy in their completion of training courses? Opus in particular has this idea of LMS assignments, that when a manager assigns you something, you can get assigned a thing to train on to do. Are they completing them? Like percentage of them that they're completing in the last 90 days. Task completion rate for location during employees, right? And on the other side, I love these final numbers, which can be done in different ways, but correlated shot performance. I think of them as like on-off numbers in sports, but the idea of when they're on the clock, what is the order's guest experience rating? Orders that are coming in during them being on the clock, what is the rating? Now they may not be the person driving that rating in some ways. They could be, working at the thing that created the impact on the guest experience might be somebody handing off the food at the expo station. They may have been standing in the back and not doing anything. That often gets missed when you're trying to do like action specific tracking. But it's like when they're on the court, when they're on the floor, what is the overall guest experience performance that's brought together by that team? And I think correlated task completion rate, correlated guest experience data, correlated throughput. These are things that, like in small data, it's hard to identify, but you run this over enough time, and you do start seeing like, oh, these people perform better. There's like stores perform better when they're on. Stores perform worse than when they're off. I think about this as I'm a basketball fan, so I think about this as a Draymond Green metric. He scores 7 points and pulls 8 rebounds, and you're like, well, why do they keep winning when he's on the floor? And it's like, well, there's all these, kind of ephemeral spaces that he's filling. And when you start using correlated performance, that can't be the only thing. You have these other indicators as well, but seeing that kind of like correlated performance also helps you attach the value. And so you end up with the idea of like, when I pull all of this together into an understanding of this kind of score, what I'm looking for is capacity. Do they have the capacity to carry more? Because then once they have that capacity, once I can be thinking about investing into my people as being of a higher capacity, I can then start looking at like, what does that mean for actually how much, like the efficiency and the effectiveness of my labor? I talk about the idea of SPLH, sales per labor hour, as being, often people go right at it. They think of it as like an input to their labor. Oh, can I bring down bring up my SPLH? I think of SPLH as being an output. It indicates that you are managing at capacity, that you're managing your capacity effectively. And that if I look at these 3 different ideas of having a low capacity staff, medium capacity staff, and high capacity staff, someone who's been around for a long time, a lot of training completed, shows high performance when they're on the floor, if you will, I end up being able to staff differently with high capacity staff than low capacity staff. Think about this even like someone in training. you're actually doubling up hours in some ways. What ends up happening when you start throwing a lot of turnover and things like that, you start having to schedule heavier just to carry the same load. And then if you then are like, well, now I'm scheduling too heavy, now I need to dial back even further, you both impact retention and you also impact capacity issues to the point where you're now not fulfilling the level of experience required for the brand. And so when you look at this and say, if I can grow my capacity, I can actually staff lighter, if you will, while actually still maintaining the level of experience and the level of performance I'm expecting, and be able to actually bring down my labor as a percentage of sales, bring up my SPLH, and actually still deliver a better guest experience ultimately. And I think this is working with Hart House and looking at like, how does that investment pull through? It's not just about warm and fuzzies. It's about building up capacity and building up a brand experience where you show the investment into the employee. You support them with training. You respond to where you're seeing gaps proactively, and then that becomes both expanded capacity and on the other side, better wages. And so we think about this when you start running this through in terms of how does the data end up like creating opportunities for triggering events, running it through a system like Opus that delivers that through into the training, and then ultimately building a culture where the operator is being supported and built upon to expand actually a brand's delivery, both of like the guest experience, but also of bottom line performance. I think that's how we like try to see this holistically in terms of, and the data sits at the core of it, but so does an LMS, and honestly, so do the humans, the managers, and the brand itself, which is identifying these areas for improvement. Anything you want to add on that, Bridget?
I just want to mark we do have 5 minutes left in the session, and I want to make sure that we have room for questions at the end. Michael asked a really good one, and something that I think has been asked in just about like every single one of our webinars. But how do you measure soft skills, or what about the things that can't be tracked by a tool? So where does that come in, and I guess how does that influence the other data that you're actually capturing?
I do think that is why I love like these correlative metrics, because I think soft skills are really hard. They remind me a little bit about when you're sending out surveys about how did people like their experience. And when you ask people on surveys to answer kind of like soft impressions things, they tend to like try to tell you what you want to hear, versus you can often use kind of inferred response or inferred interest or inferred competency. And so I think testing soft skills is hard. Training soft skills is as much a manager thing as anything else. But I think soft skills end up being inferred in a couple areas, and some of those areas do end up in the points of correlative performance. And then I think the other piece, and this is what I do like, I think Opus does well, is there's also manager triggers, right? There's also the manager has an understanding of like soft skills that are missing and finding opportunities to fill those gaps. And that's where something like that that tracking of like, oh, did they complete like these assignments that get passed through Opus and things like that, where a manager has discretion to, oh, they could really use a fill in here. That seems like a kind of a real opportunity. I worry sometimes. I appreciate data. I do worry kind of false precision sometimes when we start getting into some of these ephemeral things and start saying like manager discretion is really important. That being said, I think evaluating manager performance, I think Rachel, CEO of Opus, I think has said this in the past when I've talked with her, and she's like, the biggest driver of location performance and ultimately of guest experience is manager quality and manager performance. And I think that's a huge piece in all of this.
Absolutely echo the human side of this. There are some things that you're like data, correlative data, all of it is so incredibly helpful and useful, and you use it every day. But at the end of the day, being in the restaurant, having that quality manager assessing what's going on, answering the why. The data will tell us what, but that human component for the why, I think, speaks to a lot more of what you're going to find in the EQ space.
Absolutely. I think we have about one more minute for one more question. if anybody wants to pop in. Yeah, I mean, Matt asked, could data for soft skills be gathered from supervisor performance surveys and connected to the rest of that data? Earlier in the chat, Natalie asked about check-ins, which is a way that we try to account for that in Opus. Check-ins require a manager to kind of facilitate an in-person assessment that's tied to a module or a piece of learning, and that automatically loops in the manager to confirm that, okay, they completed their training, but did they actually understand the material there? And then the manager can perform a qualitative and quantitative report on how they did.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a good call. There's some other things that I really like, and this is more about manager performance tracking, but I really like some kind of thumbs up, thumbs down. How is your kind of an anonymous thumbs up, thumbs down for employees actually? Like how was your day today? Because I think that data is useful in the aggregate. Again, like when you start saying like any given day can go badly, but over time, like you start being able to correlate that to sometimes to location, factors, sometimes to managers specifically. But that all becomes part of this iterative cycle of managers being supported and finding their own areas for improvement, and then them being put in a position to be able to support their employees in these in between spaces. And then the data that comes out of, again, like when I think about soft skills and then I think about something like late clock in, it's like, well, those aren't related. It's like, yes, but they kind of are. Like there's like one can be a KPI. They're showing up late. You're using that as a performance indicator. It can identify a lot of other things, but there still needs to be a well-trained, well-resourced human, like who sits there and actually, acts upon it. And we talk about this a lot in terms of at Fourtop, we talk about this a lot about the idea that restaurants should be automated. A lot of restaurants should be automated. A big portion of restaurants should be automated. The thing you shouldn't automate is management and guest experience. In my opinion, like working with guests and working with staff is what good humans do in a very human-oriented business. But things like automating, training check-ins, onboarding, automating like inventory and ordering and things like that are more mathematical, put your humans in the position to be humans, and you'll find that those soft skills get much more supported because you can then hire for those soft skills more than you have to just hire for someone who can manage a P&L.
Absolutely. We are at time, but Bridget, I want to make sure that you can get some last remarks in. This has been an incredible session.
No, thank you for hosting us. And I will just echo what Darien said there. The investing in your people and having them show up with the high EQ, and automating everything else, investing in kind of going back to, I think, Michael's question earlier about, do you give employees access to this dashboard? Yes, but do I want them spending 20 minutes reading that, or 1 minute with their manager talking about it, and then the rest of the time, making sure somebody's having a good guest experience? It's all about maximizing the time for staff to spend with each other and with the guests.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much. This was like one of my favorite sessions so far, if I say so myself. If you're still on, feel free to join us next week, where we're going to go into how to create great training content as part of our Back to Basics series. You can also learn more about Fourtop by going to their website. They obviously provide a massive suite of services, and not just from data, but also consulting. And then stay in the loop for upcoming webinars and sessions happenings at Opus by signing up for our newsletter on our website. But thank you so much for joining, and have a great rest of your week.
Great. Thanks so much for hosting.